we have the Pentax ME F, a camera that holds a unique place in photographic history. But don't they all? It's not a camera that you see much today, and what makes it unique is that this is an autofocus lens. This was released in 1981. The downsizing of cameras was well underway. For the amateur market, cameras had gotten much smaller and lighter, and Pentax was certainly a part of that ongoing effort. And what makes this camera unique is that this was an early autofocus effort by a major camera manufacturer. This camera was not a commercial success. However, it did show what might be possible one day. And it's true that you do have to fail and stumble once in a while in order to be able to pick yourself up, go back to the drawing board, and figure out what works and doesn't work. From what I read, this camera was released at a price of just slightly more than $400, which was significantly more than most SLRs on the market. Of course, those didn't have an autofocus lens. 3 years earlier, I had paid, I would say, I think it was like roughly $200 to $225 for a Pentax MX with a 50mm lens. I don't recall this camera being released, but by 1981, I had sold off my Pentax MX, which I mentioned in the Pentax MX video. But anyway, I had sold that camera, and I was, I don't think you can call it heavily invested in the Nikon system, but I did have two bodies and a small group of lenses. In any case, let's take a look at this camera. It has some very unusual features. First, of course, is this autofocus lens, fairly massive, but however, it's a zoom lens. It's, I think, one of the early kit lenses, or kit zoom lenses, going from 35 to 70. Of course, one of the very early ones that was very popular was the Nikkor, I want to say it was a 43 to 86. My roommate from the Air Force, he had that lens and he used it quite a bit. I don't know if he still has that lens. If I talk to him again, I will find out. Although for the purpose of this video, it makes no difference. So this used a modified version of Pentax's K-mount. And when I say modified, you can see the reason why. It's because there are 5 contacts. It's interesting, 4 are raised and 1 is inset. And they, of course, made it to these contacts here on the body. You could mount any other K-mount lens to the body. Like so. And then it would work just as any other traditional manual focus lens would work. This was based on the Pentax ME, so it was automatic, but it was really based on the Pentax ME Super, which offered some manual control. And it was through use of these two buttons here. I'll cover that some other time. There are 2 other buttons here on the left side to go from f2.8 to 3.5. I need to actually take a look at that for a better understanding of it. You could also turn off the autofocus confirmation. Actually, cameras today even do this where they will beep to confirm focus. You could turn that off if you found that annoying. There was some exposure compensation. And of course, you had your lift and turn dial for setting your film speed. Like the Pentax ME, this dial locked when it was set to auto exposure. That means you couldn't accidentally turn it off of that. You could turn it off, but it was a very conscious effort. Press in that button while turning the dial, and you could switch to some of your other modes. In this case, it was a fully well, I shouldn't say fully, it was battery dependent for auto exposure. So you had several manual speeds. One was B, bulb. The other one was X. Your flash synchronization appears to be 1/125th of a second. So you did have a 1/125th of a second should you run out of battery power. This also had a manual self-timer. However, it did not have a depth of field preview. Going to the back of the camera, fairly traditional. This is your frame counter on the back and your eyepiece. And then here was a small little film minder holder. And so how this always worked was you would tear off the end of your film box, slip it in here, and then you would know what type of film you had loaded. Always worked best if you didn't change film types that often. I'm not sure what the use of these 2 contacts is. I took a look online, but I couldn't really tell, so I'm not really sure what's going on. This was your connection point for a film advance, your tripod socket, which was in line with the center of the lens. These electrical contact points most assuredly had to do with the automatic winder. Here's your rewind button. It's a single press rewind button, which means you just pressed it once, and then you would unfold your rewind crank to rewind your film. Very simple. Finally, this small button releases the battery door. You can't open the battery door unless you first press this button. So opening the battery door was a two-handed procedure. Press and hold that button, and then the battery door opens. As you can tell, this camera, unlike most other cameras from that time, took 4 batteries. And so they used either LR44 or S76 or what's today known as Energizer 357. That's the Ever-Ready brand. So let's pop some batteries in here. So this certainly was a bit of a battery hog because now it required you to use 4 batteries instead of 2. I don't know the longevity of the batteries, but it probably was decent. So remember, in a camera, you should always use either silver oxide or lithium, and if at all possible, don't use alkaline. All right, what was the orientation? They had little plus and minus symbols, so that was helpful. All right, let's pop those batteries in here. Plus, plus, then minus, and then minus. These were not batteries you could replace quickly, obviously. Slide that. So you press and slide it, and then it locks into place. Take care of the autofocus. Use 4 alkaline batteries. And they have small little notations in here. I just put these batteries in here so they haven't been sitting in here for that long, minutes, rather than weeks and months and years. So you can see this is a press and turn affair. Press, turn to unlock the battery holder, get it lined up, press and turn again clockwise to lock it. This was a fairly traditional K-mount mechanically. To engage the autofocus, you had to do 2 things. First, you had to set the camera to auto, or at least I believe you do. And then the second thing is you had to set this also, turn this on. And you did that by moving this small little slide on the bottom of the lens. So this is a case where the industry obviously has never found any consistent use of red. In almost all cases, when you pair red and green together, green means go, red means stop. However, not with this lens, because as you can read, green is stop, green is no-go, it's off, and red is on. That might be true in, well, I can't think of any case in which it was true. If you came up to a green light and you were supposed to stop and you were supposed to go on a red light, that doesn't make any sense. And so, like I said, when you pair up red and green, we have a predetermined thought of what each of those mean. If you look back at cameras through history, you'll often see conflicting or contradictory uses of a red symbol. In some cases, red means ready. In other cases, red means not ready. It's something that the entire industry has never really understood. Very confusing. So to engage the autofocus, it didn't matter if the camera was set on manual speed or on manual exposure or that single manual exposure speed of 1/125th. Most users would leave this on auto. Once you do that, you press one of these buttons either on the top or on the side to focus the lens. So you can see that it's not an incredibly fast focusing lens. And its close focus distance was only 4 feet. That had some limitations in its own right. One thing that you will notice, there's a very slight double beep. You could override the autofocus simply by turning the outer focusing ring. There are two indicators in the viewfinder beneath the focusing screen. They're simply arrows pointing inward. One pointing this way, another pointing this way. All the arrows would do would be to indicate in which direction you should the focusing ring needed to be turned. And of course, you know, like I said, the motors in the lens would handle that. So this wasn't a traditional focusing ring, obviously. This was simply to give you a way to grip the lens. The two buttons, of course, would allow you to autofocus in landscape mode or in portrait mode, depending on which way you would turn the camera, oriented the camera. This also demanded you to hold the camera more or less correct as a photographer, because this really demanded that you hold the camera in your left hand. I suppose you could do it this way, but it certainly is more awkward. It's a lot easier if you cradle the lens and camera in your hand and use the thumb on your left hand to depress the focus button. So this was a fairly quick lens, actually at 2.8. The zoom range was 35 to 70. And it was what we call a push-pull style zoom. So it was still fairly convenient to use. And if the batteries in the autofocus died, you could still focus manually simply by gripping and turning the small serrated portion of the lens barrel. Apertures were set here. And so as you turned your aperture ring, you would see the indicated shutter speed change. One thing to keep in mind is that the lens would only focus if you kept that button depressed. So as soon as you lifted your finger off of the button, the lens would stop focusing. But because of the slowness of the focusing action, it probably wouldn't be appropriate for sports photography. This is a fairly massive camera. Let's just say that. And of course, all of its weight is owing to the lens and the 4 batteries that go into the lens. Let's take a look and see how things compare weight-wise. As I mentioned, this is really a Pentax ME with autofocus capability built into the body. So if we were to just take this camera with the standard 1.7 lens, you would see that it weighs 1 pound, 7.8 ounces, or 1 pound, 8 ounces, 1.5 pounds. Now the lens itself with batteries weighs nearly as much. It certainly outweighs the body. So it's 1 pound, 5.8 ounces, or 1 pound, 6 ounces. The body alone, the body by itself, weighs 1 pound, 1 ounces. So together the two are going to weigh 2 pounds, 7 ounces? Yes, 2 pounds, 7 ounces. What a guess. So if we compare this to the Canon AE1, one of the very popular cameras in that era, you would see that the Canon weighs 1 pound, 10 ounces. So we're talking about a difference of 13 ounces. So at 2 pounds, 7 ounces, that's a substantial amount of weight for a 35 millimeter camera. So when you combine that with the fact that the autofocus didn't work all that great, you know, I think you would opt for the non-autofocus camera. However, as I mentioned, sometimes, you know, you have to have failures before you can really progress. I don't know about the optical performance of this lens. 35 to 70 is adequate range in, you know, mild telephoto, or medium telephoto of 70 millimeters to medium wide angle of 35 millimeters. Being a 2x zoom, it probably performed adequately. I should shoot with this sometime, and then I'll know for sure. And of course, the problems that you'll often see is that the center of the image is going to be fine. The problem always is when you get to the corners of the image. I had some free time, so I put a Sony E-mount adapter onto the lens and mounted it to a full-frame Sony. a full-frame Sony mirrorless camera, and just ran outside for a few minutes and took some shots. So what I found was at 35 millimeters, there's quite a bit of barrel distortion, and at 70 millimeters, there's a bit of pincushion distortion, which I suppose wasn't really surprising. Although, I was sort of hoping that with a zoom range of just 35 to 70, you really wouldn't see that. So that did surprise me a bit. Not surprisingly, it is, I think when you're photographing a flat object, there is some softness in the corners, and at 35 millimeters, there's some vignetting as well. Also at the 35 millimeter setting, at least I think it was 35 millimeter, there's some odd aberration in out of focus areas, so it doesn't have that smooth bokeh that everybody likes to talk about. However, when this lens was released back in the early 1980s, that wasn't really a thing. Nobody talked about it, and so certainly nobody obsessed over it. In real world use, and you'll see in these last two photographs, I think it actually acquits itself pretty well. I think it does a good job of recording a fairly sharp image. The one limitation, as I mentioned earlier, is the 4-foot close focus distance. So that really, I think, more than anything else, bothered me. Because I'm with an SLR, I'm really used to focusing much closer than 4 feet. So let's get back to the rest of the review. So let's take a quick look inside this camera. I suspect that there are no surprises here. So we'll open the back, lift up on the rewind crank, back pops open. So inside it's fairly traditional. You have your pressure plate, and of course the role of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against the film rails so that when your photo is taken, you get as sharp an image as possible. Here's your empty spool. Here's the chamber for your fresh roll film. Loads traditionally from left to right. This used Pentax, what they called magic fingers. And so all you would do is you would insert the leader of the film in between one of these fingers, as they called it. It would grab hold, and then it eliminated the need of trying to tuck the film into a particular slot in the camera. As most cameras did during that era, when it advanced the film, the emulsion side was on the outside of the take-up spool. As I've mentioned in the past, this was a very common practice, so no surprise there. Here's your sprocket wheel, and this is fairly traditional. You could remove the back of this camera. I don't know if Pentax made a data back for the ME. That's what that would be for, or perhaps for some type of service reason. Just not sure about that. Okay. The body covering is the same as what was used on most of Pentax's other cameras, including its larger K series and M series. I can't recall if the late Spotmatic SLRs used this type of body covering. However, it was very grippable, felt good in your hands, and did what it was supposed to do. What's notable about this body covering is, unlike some other cameras, this one has tended not to shrink over the years and has, in fact, remained tightly bound to the camera. I'm a bit surprised that there isn't a tripod mount here on the lens, because that would make a lot more sense. Because the lens outweighs the camera, what happens is when you mount this to a tripod, it really puts a lot of stress on the tripod mount. And in fact, if you notice, the tripod socket is extremely deep, much deeper than it is on most cameras. As I said, it would have been better if they had put a tripod mount or tripod socket right here. This is a very curious camera. There are a lot of different switches, and this whole idea of many switches and buttons and things. This has always been one of the issues that I've had, particularly with Japanese cameras, because not only did you have the presence of all these buttons and switches, you had to remember each of their functions. And that holds true to today's digital cameras, which have a proliferation of buttons, switches, and dials, and then there's the menus, and then often with each successive model, the menu changes slightly, or the location or function of the buttons changes. So then you have to relearn all of that, all of the uses of all those buttons. So anyway, that's a side rant. So this camera also had a single synchronization port. By this time, it looked like they were doing away with the bulb flash synchronization port. This also had a hot shoe. It also had another contact point, which would indicate that this had a dedicated flash unit. The flash unit, of course, would provide more accurate exposure, and I think in some cases, I don't know if it's with this camera, but in some cases, this also would set the camera automatically to the correct flash synchronization speed. Design-wise, this body followed the same path as the other Pentax M series cameras, and of course, why wouldn't it? Because it in fact is a Pentax M series camera. So you have your pinched pentaprism design right here. They also had done away, I think, some time ago with the name Asahi. Now it just said Pentax. And that could be an effort to westernize its brand. Now, the naming of the camera, ME and then F, it's a bit unusual because F, I guess, would stand for focus, but you would think they would have made it MEAF. Maybe that was just far too many letters to be putting on a camera. So if you are looking for something with an unusual place in history, or you want to try, an early version of autofocus, feel free to find these on the used market. I think there's still plenty available. They're not that expensive, simply because there's not a great demand for slow autofocus lens. Like the other M series cameras, it's fairly small, fairly compact. The ME, as I recall, is slightly taller than the MX. So that might be a plus, if you're out there looking for an M series camera. And as I mentioned, you can use any of the K-mount lenses with this, either the so-called M series lenses or the fuller size just K-mount lenses. And there's a large number of third-party K-mount lenses. So the one curious thing that this camera did offer when using a manual focus lens is it provided focus confirmation. So if you were to, of course, you had to slightly depress the shutter release, so you would activate the meter, and then you would focus the lens. And when the lens was in focus, or when the image was in focus, it would give you that small beep. The cool thing about Pentax is that it offered a lot of backward and forward compatibility. So this lens is off of a Foley autofocus, a much later autofocus camera. This is off of the, well, let's just pull it out. This is off of the Pentax SF1. So if you compare the two, you can see how much larger the SF is than the ME, or in this case, the ME F. However, you can take this lens and you can mount it to the to this body, and it will work just as you expect it would. In this case, you're going to be using manually set apertures. So take it off of A. And you can either manual focus, well, you would need to manually focus the lens here. It is interesting that you had that backward and forward compatibility. That is, you could use the older M manual focus lens, and you could use lenses in the future, the lenses yet to come. So who would have imagined that? By 1984, this camera was out of production and I believe off the market. certainly by 1985. There probably were some still left in the retail channel that continued to be sold, but as far as production concerned, production had ended, and this camera was now just a piece of history, or would soon become a piece of history. So very interesting piece, probably not the greatest photographic tool, but certainly one worth taking a look at in this video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you'd like to see me cover a particular camera or lens in the future, let me know in the comments below, or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. Have a great day, and get out there and take some photographs.